Bernie Sanders had an interview recently with Chris Hayes on MSNBC about working class and what people need if you are a part of the working class. Now, this may sound repetitive to many of you because we've heard Bernie Sanders make these statements before. But I want to point out something in this particular interview, because there is something that I did notice in this conversation. Let's go ahead and get into it. Shout out to Case Study QB for this clip. Let's dive right in. Here we go.
Welcome. Senator, I want to start with the history here. I think when you look in retrospect at the recovery from the great financial crisis, that period of austerity and enforced spending cuts, the sequester after 2011, really did appreciably hurt the recovery, hurt working people, hurt wage growth and job growth during that period. Are you thinking about that as you think about this next year?
The answer is yes. And what I'm also thinking about, Chris, is we live in a moment in history where we have more wealth and income inequality in America today than perhaps ever in the history of this country.
I told you, repetitive. He's saying the same thing he's been saying for years. But let's go on.
People owning more wealth than the bottom half. We have a working class today where weekly wages adjusted for inflation for the average American worker is lower than it was 50 years ago. You got millions of people working for starvation wages, 10, 11, 12 bucks an hour. So clearly what we have got to do in Congress is have the courage to stand up to powerful corporate interests and their lobbyists and start working for working families, not just the 1%.
Okay, let's pause there for just a second. Let's go ahead and chime in here. So Bernie Sanders just told you we have to stand up to those corporations. People in Congress have to do that. So in that case, instead of talking to us, because we're not in Congress, let's just be real, why not have that conversation with the squad, Bernie Sanders? Why not tell them to do that? Why not push back against some of the legislation that Bernie Sanders himself has supported that contributes to the military-industrial complex, that contributes to companies like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Raytheon? Bernie Sanders votes along with this legislation. Most of the time, he votes along with those things that help those corporate entities that he continues to criticize. So I don't know who he's talking to anymore. I used to fall for this, right? Like I used to fall for this. I don't know who Bernie Sanders is asking to do this. Now he's having the interview with Chris Hayes saying, we have to. But there's no we. It's him. It's him and the rest of them who are actually in Congress. They have to do those things. Let's go on.
When you say the working class, how do you define that term? How do you think about it?
I think it is the vast majority of the American people, maybe significantly brown and black disproportionately, but it is tens and tens of millions of people. And I got to tell you something, Chris, we don't.
Pause. Let's go back just a little bit here. Something he said right about here.
I think it is the vast majority of the American people, maybe significantly brown and black disproportionately.
Vast majority of the American people, specifically brown and black people, disproportionately. So Bernie Sanders is acknowledging that, but yet at the same time, Bernie Sanders did not support policies that would specifically target black communities and brown communities. Let's go with black communities because that's what I am. Bernie Sanders did not support any type of policy that was only to help Black Americans. And what do I mean by that? Bernie Sanders was against reparations for African Americans, but Bernie Sanders supported reparations for his people. And I've talked about that before multiple times on this show. That is a problem. And more people need to call that out. So why was that okay? Why was it okay for him to support it for his people, but not for African Americans? Now, this is not to say that Bernie Sanders is racist. Obviously, I think that's ridiculous. But what it is to say is that Bernie Sanders still had this belief, and you just heard from Camilla at the beginning of the show. Bernie Sanders still has this belief that by implementing these universal programs, that is going to help everybody get on the same level. And it does not help everybody get on the same level. Yes, everybody needs health care. Yes, universal pre-K could help everybody who has kids to have that opportunity so they don't have to pay for that. Yes, those things do help. Free public college does help. But even when you have those programs, Black people are still going to be behind because of the lack of generational wealth and because of the fact that we did not get the 40 acres and a mule that we were promised. Camilla and I, we just went through all of this, all the history of it. So he acknowledges to you that it is disproportionately Black and brown communities, but he does not support the projects, the principles, the policies that specifically target those communities only. We have to point this out. And I know people have brought this up before when he ran again in 2020, but I want you to really understand what Bernie Sanders is saying here. Doesn't mean he's a bad person, but it does show that there is a blind spot. Let's go on.
But it is tens and tens of millions of people. And I got to tell you something, Chris. We don't talk about those people anywhere near enough. We don't talk about the fact that life expectancy for working class people is going down. And the gap between how long wealthy people live and working people live is just very, very wide. We don't talk about the fact 85 million Americans have no health insurance. People can't afford prescription drugs. And I think we have got to start focusing on the majority of the American people are working class, middle class, lower income people. It is.
When are we going to start doing that, though? See, this is the thing. Like, who's the we? Because people who are already working class, they know these things. What are they supposed to do? People who are poor, they already know they can't afford these things. They know that if you don't have health insurance, you know you don't have it. If you know you can't afford health care, you know you can't afford it. So again, who's the we? Let's go on.
It's quite unbelievable. You got 18 million families in America who spend 50% of their limited incomes on housing. How do you survive on that? How do you survive on $14 an hour? Those are the issues we got to start focusing on.
But at the end of the day, even Bernie Sanders is going to tell you to vote for his corporate Democrat opponent who is against helping those people. So how are we supposed to get working class people? How are we supposed to give them a better life? How are we supposed to give poor people a better life? How are we supposed to get people out of poverty if every time that Bernie Sanders runs, he tells you, yeah, just go ahead and support Joe Biden, support Hillary Clinton, support the same corporate Democrat that I told you to fight against? How are those people supposed to get out of their situation if you continue doing the same thing? You continue to revolve in this never-ending cycle. How's that supposed to change? This is why I tell people to focus on what you can do on the local level. You get more opportunities there. I've seen it in my state, in Massachusetts. There's a lot more that has been done here. Some of the progressive policies that Bernie Sanders has run on the national level, we've already passed in Massachusetts. It's already been implemented. I think this is where the focus needs to go. See what you can do on the local level, because let me tell you, until you get corporate money out of electoral politics on the national level, this is not going to change. They'll give you a little book. Look, during a pandemic, they still couldn't give everybody health care. Does that make sense to you? You had hundreds and thousands of people in this country dying, and your politicians in DC still didn't want to give you health care. They couldn't even give you the $2,000 stimulus check that they promised to give you during the pandemic. Let's go on.
I want to follow up on something you just said, because this is something I've been really focused on recently. Many of the trends you're describing, whether it's wage stagnation or growing inequality, are true for decades, right? They sort of can move up and down depending on what's going on at that period, but the general trends. One of those, though, is a product of 2015 on, and that's the drop in life expectancy. The U.S. is undergoing a drop in life expectancy, particularly disproportionately located in working and poor folks. That's basically unlike anything. I mean, the COVID is a huge part of that. We've seen it in other rich countries, but what's happening in the U.S. is unlike anywhere else. And it strikes me as bizarre that this central statistical fact about the country isn't an urgent matter of policy debate in Washington across the political spectrum.
It was an urgent matter of policy debate, Chris Hayes, but people like you and Rachel Maddow and all the commentators on The View and the commentators on CNN heavily smeared these policies, starting with 2015. You see, Chris Hayes was part of the problem. People like him, they heavily smeared these policies. It wasn't just people like, oh, it was just Fox News. No, bullshit. Liberal media did it too. Because see, even liberal media doesn't want that kind of information to get out to the masses. They don't want the American people to really wake up and say, wait a minute, I'm really being screwed by the top 1%. Why am I putting up with that? They don't want people to get that message and get riled up. And when you saw the thousands and thousands of people that came out to support Bernie Sanders, I'm talking about the fact if you go to a Bernie Sanders rally and you have 10,000 people there, that is not what they wanted to happen. So every time these policies came up, people like Chris Hayes, especially Medicare for All, people like Chris Hayes were like, they're going to take your health insurance away. All of them said it. Even Pete Buttigieg said it, even though he had said he was supported Medicare for All at the beginning of his campaign and then changed his mind as it got closer to the debates. Oh, I remember. Even Kamala Harris, she was another one who flip-flopped because she knew the establishment did not want that. They knew that Big Pharma did not want that. So it's funny to me that Chris Hedges is sitting here saying, why wasn't this a part of a big national discussion debate? It was a part of the discussion, but people like you smeared it over and over and over again. So the fact that he's even presenting this now is like, oh, this is something new. This should happen. This is a new idea. It's laughable to me. When I told you earlier tonight, on RBN, me and JB were talking about mainstream media. I told you guys earlier tonight, mainstream media is failing, you guys. CNN just announced they're closing their headquarters in Atlanta. I've been to that headquarters. That one is huge. They are failing. And it makes me smile because that means that more people are waking up.
That people are dying earlier. That's the whole point of having a flourishing societies to give people longer lives.
Chris, you're absolutely right. And you have to read my book. It's coming out in a month or so. We got several chapters on that issue.
What was that? Oh, no. You got to do what, Chris?
To give people longer lives.
Chris, you're absolutely right. And you have to read my book. It's coming out.
Read my book. Buy my book. If you want more information about this, go buy my book. You see how this works?
Out in a month or so. We got several chapters on that issue. But here is the point. How does it happen that despite spending almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as the people of other industrialized nations, our life expectancy is lower and getting worse? And as you point out, it is getting.
You know the answer to that question, though. Bernie Sanders knows the answer to his own question. Why is he asking Chris Hedges? Chris is not, or not Chris Hedges, excuse me, Chris Hayes. Chris is not in Congress.
How does it happen that despite spending almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as the people of other industrialized nations, our life expectancy is lower and getting worse?
Because we don't have universal health care for everyone in this country, Bernie. Bernie Sanders knows this. He knows that the food is worse now. He knows that the quality of life is lower. because we have large poverty in this country. Bernie Sanders knows this. He sounds like he's trying to run another campaign. Buy my book.
And as you point out, it is getting really bad for low-income and working-class people. And what the doctors tell us, and I've studied this issue a bit, is we're looking at what they call diseases of despair. When people are going nowhere in their lives, they can't afford health care and education, their kids are worse off. They turn to drugs, they turn to alcohol, they turn to even suicide.
Because poverty is stressful. Being poor is stressful. Surprise. Being poor is stressful. It can be depressing. Yes, it can put you in a state of despair. It's stressful not knowing if you're going to be able to pay your rent next month. It's stressful not knowing if you're going to have heat next month because you're behind on the heat bill the month before because you couldn't pay that one. It's stressful nowadays, especially going to the grocery store and paying $9 for a carton of eggs. It's stressful trying to ration your gas just so you can get to work. And that was before inflation. If you were already poor, you were already dealing with these types of struggles. And then you add inflation on top of it. So yes, it's stressful.
So you're right. This is an issue of enormous consequence, which we should be discussing and working on a lot more.
Is there a single policy you can imagine improving life for folks, working people in this country in the year 2023 that could pass the Republican House?
I would hope, I've seen polls where Republicans regard the high cost of prescription drugs as a major, major concern.
Let's reframe the question. Listen to what he says.
Discussing and working on a lot more.
Is there a single policy you can imagine improving life for folks, working people in this country in the year 2023 that could pass the Republican House?
I said reframe it because what about the Democrat House? Yes, the Republicans have the House now. But the same policy that Chris Hayes is referring to, it won't pass the Democrat House. Let's be real here. Why have they not voted on the Medicare for All bill that Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal created? Why? Because according to Ro Khanna, they don't have the votes. And that was under the Democrat House. When I interviewed Ro Khanna, the House was Democrat majority. And he said it would not pass. So here's Chris. You see what the liberal media is doing? This is Chris Hayes saying, is there any policy that can help working class people that the Republicans in the House would actually pass? But Chris Hayes didn't ask this question when the Democrats had the House, because Chris Hayes already knew the answer. It wasn't going to pass the Democrat House either. So he should reframe the question. The way that he should have asked this question was, is there any policy that's going to benefit working class people that can pass a Democrat or a Republican House? You see how they frame the question? So the average viewer who was watching this is like, damn, those Republicans are not going to really don't like working class people. It's because of those Republicans in the House that these items are not going to get passed to help out the working class people, not even thinking about the fact that those items wouldn't get passed through a Democrat majority House either.
I would hope, I've seen polls where Republicans regard the high cost of prescription drugs as a major, major concern. I would hope that Republicans and Democrats could come together to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry, who in some cases are charging us 10 times more for the same exact drugs as sold in Canada and other countries.
But Bernie Sanders already knows that the Republicans and the Democrats are not going to have bipartisan support over that because, one, there are Republican politicians that are in bed with Big Pharma, and there are Democrat politicians that are in bed with Big Pharma. They have the same donors. Blue Cross Blue Shield doesn't just donate to the Republican Party. They donate to the Democrats too. Same with United Healthcare. Same with Cigna, Aetna, all of them. So Bernie Sanders knows this, you guys. This is why this drives me crazy. He knows damn well that the majority of those politicians in DC are in bed with Big Pharma, and that is why that Medicare for All bill will not pass in the House. So why is Bernie Sanders sitting here and trying to gaslight the American people and to make them think that somehow the Republicans and the Democrats are going to have bipartisan support over this type of issue when he knows that is not the case? It's not supported by both parties. There are a few people in the Democratic Party that do support that Medicare for All bill. The majority don't.
I would also hope that while I know we're not going to pass a Medicare for All system, which I would like to see, at least maybe we could expand primary health care all over this country so that every American can get to a doctor when he or she needs to do that.
All right.
This is a damn shame. So that every American can get to a doctor when they need to. Wasn't it just announced today that Joe Biden is sending another package to Ukraine? All the money going out the door to people in another country. They've given them packages that include healthcare and clean drinking water. But they can't give us that. Do you guys see the problem? Bernie Sanders won't mention that, though. What I just said, Bernie Sanders isn't going to mention that in that interview. You know why? Because Bernie want to keep his seat.